Well, good morning, everybody. We've been studying together the extraordinary life of Moses, somebody that I've been hoping that we will come to look upon as a good friend who taught us amazing things about God. My name is Scott, and I'm here on the Knox Hall stage for our modern service. I want to welcome those of you joining us right now via video feed from our sanctuary, from our classic service. We're one church with different worship expressions. I'm also aware we've got a number of folks worshiping with us online and listening by radio, so glad that you're all here today. You remember we saw when Moses was called by God through the burning bush. And God said to Moses, I want you to go to Pharaoh, tell him to let my people go. God said, I'm going to bring my people up out from under the hand of the Egyptians, and I'm going to bring them to a good and spacious land. And here's the biblical language that often gets used for the promised land. A good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Milk and honey. Why milk and honey? Some of you are thinking that doesn't sound so great. I'm lactose intolerant, and honey is just a sticky mess. But you understand, for the ancient world, to describe a land flowing with milk and honey may have been, for the ancient world, the best way to describe a land of abundance. There's a place for crops. There's a place for animals. It's a fertile land. It's a spacious land, not constricting like they had known before. God says, I'm going to rescue my people, and Moses, you get to play a role. I want you to bring my people from a bad land to a good land, from a land of scarcity to a land of abundance, from a land of hopelessness to a land of promise, from a land of bondage to a land of freedom. Now, God does not give a lot of instructions at this point. There aren't a lot of details given on the front end, but the mission is clear. Moses, I want you to lead my people from point A to point B. And this story has resonated with people of all faiths for thousands of years because this is the human story. At some level, we all live in Egypt. We all live in captivity. Many people in our world today do live as actual slaves. Slavery still exists on our planet. There are many people whose oppressors are real. But for most of us gathered here today, most of us watching online, most of us listening, our prisons are of our own making. Right? We are captive to our fears. We are captive to expectations, to our habits, to our past. Right? We just can't get past our past. And so the chains that we wear are of the invisible kind. We long to be delivered from bondage to a place of promise and freedom and abundance. This is the longing of the human spirit. What we forget, or maybe what we choose to forget, is that the way to the promised land is through the desert. As we're becoming all that God wants us to become, we're going to take some desert detours. How many of you, by a show of hands, love detours? You know, when you're trying to get somewhere in a hurry and you see those orange cones in the distance and big arrows, and you get closer and the sign says detour, how many of you are just filled with joy for the unexpected adventure that awaits you? No, we say detours are a pain. Detours are going to take me someplace I don't want to go. Detours are a distraction from my mission. But I've got good news for you today from the Bible, and that is that God does some of his best work on detours. God does some of his best shaping work, kind of work that can't be done anywhere else except on detours. God is the God of the detour. And this is my premise this morning, and I want to trace this out in the life of our friend Moses. You remember Moses' mission starts out poorly. The Pharaoh says, no way, I will not let those people go. I will not let the Israelites go. And the people are mad at Moses. And it's going to take 10 plagues, 10 calamities to change the mind of Pharaoh. And I hope you're keeping up on your reading and you've read about those plagues. Very important. When we outlined it in the small group curriculum, it talks more about the plagues. But eventually, Pharaoh relents. He says, Moses, go. Take your people out of here. Get them far away from my people. Go, go, go. Now, I want you to look at a map here. If this is right here, point A to point B. This is point A. That's where they are in Egypt. And this is B over here in the Promised Land. And you see kind of the Dead Sea here, and it kind of goes off the map, but the River Jordan. This is the land of milk and honey. This is the land promised to the ancestors. This is the ancestral home of Joseph. And you notice in the reading, they're carrying Joseph's bones with them out of Egypt to his ancestral home. Kind of creepy, but that's what they did. And this distance between A and B from Egypt to the Promised Land is a distance of about 250 miles. It's about the same distance between here and Traverse City. So take a look at me here for a moment. If you had to walk between here and Traverse City, that'd be a long walk to do without a car, right? I don't know how long would it take you to walk from here to Traverse City. 250 miles. If you did 10 miles a day, you could do it in 25 days. If you want to take, I'd probably go a little slower. I want to stop a few places for several nights. But you could easily do it in 40 days, right? This path could be done easily in 40 days. But it did not take the Israelites 40 days. How long did it take them to get to the Promised Land? 40 years. So bring the cameras back to me here. The 40 years to go, which is why people quip, well, if only Moses had stopped to ask for directions, or boy, if a woman had been in charge, they'd have got there a lot faster. But remember that Moses had instructions. Remember in our text, he's got the pillar of cloud by day, pillar of fire by night. This is the original GPS. Just follow the cloud to the Promised Land. And when they leave Egypt, they're following the cloud, and it's going right to the Promised Land, 250 miles to go, and suddenly the cloud turns south. Right? What do you do when it feels like God is leading you in a direction that you think is wrong? What do you do when God leads you to a place you do not want to go? And this becomes the great tension for the people of the Exodus. Will they trust God? Will they see it through? So look at the map here. The route of the Exodus is much debated. The topography has changed a lot in the last 4,000 years. And even the names of the ancient cities mentioned in the Bible aren't all that helpful because we're not for certain where those cities existed. We do know it mentions the city of Ramses. They were here in the city of Ramses. And it does say in the Bible they went to a city called Succoth down here. Terrible name for a city, but that's where they went. And then it says they turned north toward the sea. And so the crossing of the Red Sea probably happened up here somewhere. And again, this is debated. Your Bible might say that still they crossed the Red Sea, but your Bible probably doesn't say that. If it does say that, there's probably a footnote there that says they crossed the Hebrew words, the Yam Sup, which is translated the Sea of Reeds, not the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds. We don't know where the Sea of Reeds was, but we do know this area up here was all kinds of lakes were up here, big lakes, and probably the sea crossing was up here. But no less miraculous, and you know the story from the Bible. This is a story that Hollywood loves to make movies from. The Israelites are out in the wilderness, and Pharaoh changes his mind. Remember this? Pharaoh says, why did we let the slaves go? And he sends the army to bring the slaves back or to kill them. And so it's a dramatic scene. The ex-slaves are out in the wilderness. A large body of water is behind them. And on the horizon, they can see the dust being formed from the chariots of Pharaoh's army coming to get them. 600 chariots coming their way. Chariots were the game changer of ancient warfare. This was the new technology of its day, gave military advantage to those who had it, and the finest army is coming right at this band of ex-slaves. They're locked in by a body of water behind them. They're completely trapped. There's nothing they can do. This is going to have to be the deliverance of God. And I think God set it up this way. There'd be no mistake about from whom this deliverance came. And the people say to Moses, Moses, why did you lead us out here in the wilderness to die? We could do that back in Egypt. They're complaining. And Moses has this great line from Exodus chapter 14, verse 13. Moses answered the people, do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to what? Be still. This is going to be the work of God. This is the work of God. God's going to have to do this deliverance. And then let's read a bit of the story, if you don't mind me reading to you a little more of the story of the Exodus. I want to read a chunk here from Exodus chapter 14. You okay? Listen to the story again. It says, "Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, 'Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them and against Egypt.' Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen.' Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and the horsemen. The entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea, not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses his servant. And generations would look back on this event as their defining event. This is the day that God saved his people. This is the day of salvation. This is the salvation event that defined the Jewish people. And one scholar said, if you ask a Jewish person, ask a Jew, who are you? They might answer the question in terms of this story. They might say, I was in bondage. God delivered me from my captivity. Through the waters I came, and now I live in a place of blessing and abundance and a land flowing blessing. And really, would the followers of Jesus describe themselves any differently? I was in captivity. God delivered me from captivity. Through the waters I came, maybe through the waters of baptism, the New Testament intimates. And now I live in the blessing, under the blessing of God. I live in the abundance of God. If there's any place in the Bible, in the Old Testament, that we can read Christologically, that we can read Jesus into, it is this story, because the writers of the New Testament do this. The New Testament refers back to this story again and again. And just to spell out some of the ways that Jesus is in the Old Testament Exodus, let me spell it out. Number one, Christ's salvation also is all about getting us out of bondage. There's no more basic Bible word than the word redemption, and that word in the original Greek meant to loose. Redemption literally means to free from bondage. So at the heart of our understanding of what it means to be redeemed is this idea of being released from captivity. Number two, Christ's salvation is also by grace. Like the Exodus event, God brings the deliverance, God parts the sea, God arranges everything. It's not even based on the amount of your faith. Sometimes people say, well, to go to heaven, to be with God, you have to believe with your whole heart, right? You can't have any doubt at all. Isn't that right? But the Exodus event, I love the way they spell the details about a wall of water on the left, a wall of water on the right. And no doubt some of the Egyptians walking through there were really confident. They were walking through, man, this is cool. Wall of water. God is so good. Eat our dust, Egyptians. They were walking through with confidence. But no doubt other Israelites were walking through, looking at the wall of water on the right, the wall of water on the left, and they were thinking, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die. But they walked through, and everybody got to the other side safely. God delivered both those who believed with a full heart, and God delivered those who had doubt. Why? Because we are saved not because of the amount of our faith. We are saved because of the object of our faith, our Redeemer, the one who fights for us. Everything in this story says grace, 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 grace. Moses says, be still, and the Lord will fight for you. Number 3, Christ's salvation involves crossing over. The Israelites did not have to have a perfect faith. They just had to have enough faith to step out into the seabed floor. They had to have enough faith to cross over to the other side. To say, if I stay here where I am, this means certain death. And I'm gonna have enough faith to move. And likewise with Jesus, you do not need a faith without doubt. You just need enough faith to say, God, I'm not going to stay where I am. I'm going to step out in trust. And I may not trust you completely, God, but I trust you enough to move. I trust you enough to walk to the other side, to cross over. And there is a crossing over involved with Jesus. And you could do that today by praying kind of that way. God, I trust you, maybe not completely, but I cross over to the other side. And number 4, Christ is our mediator. Moses plays this unique role in the Exodus. He's a guy kind of in between. He represents the people and he represents God. And we see this fleshed out in some odd ways. In one scene that we read, the people complain and Moses gets rebuked by God. That doesn't seem very fair, really. He's getting blamed for something the people did. And then in the text we read, Moses stretches out his hand over the sea. And the next half of the verse it says, but God parted the waters. And so here's what Tim Keller writes about this passage. Tim Keller says, here's what you've got. You've got a man so identified with the Israelites that their guilt is upon him. And a man so identified with God that God's power is coming through him. Moses is the man in the middle. He's so identified with the people, he gets rebuked for their sin. And he's so identified with God that he's a vehicle for God's saving power. But then he writes this, he says, but I know a better mediator. We don't have in Jesus Christ just a mediator who is fully man and close to God. We have a mediator who is fully God and fully man. So the Israelites now stand on the other side of the sea, having been delivered by God. End of story, close of scene. Is that right? Is the story over here? Not by a long shot. Look back at the map. Where are the people now? The people are somewhere, let me clean this up. Okay. The people are somewhere over here, right? They've crossed the sea. They're here waiting. They're still following the pillar of cloud. Where does that pillar go? Does the pillar go up here to the promised land? It does not. Where does the pillar go? The pillar turns due south, right? Again, the route of the Exodus is not known. This is much debated, but the traditional route of the Exodus is that they came down here, that they camped out here at Mount Sinai. We're not even certain, but we think this is the Mount Sinai of the Bible. And then they came up around, and they got up here. This is where they sent the spies in, and the spies said, we can't go in there. And so it left them looping around a little bit here in the wilderness. And then eventually they come up around here. Moses will make his final stand here at Mount Nebo. He'll look over. He's not allowed to go in. And eventually they will cross over into the promised land, to the land that God has promised to them. God does not take them on the shortest route. God does not take them on the expected route. God says they're not ready for the promised land, so he takes them on a tour in the desert, a detour in the desert. The desert is a very important place in the Bible, and many of God's people will spend extended time in the desert, including Jesus. If you're a follower of God, you can count on the fact that you will log some time in the desert at some point. You will spend time there. All God's people spend some time in the desert. And it's going to feel to you like a pain-filled distraction from your mission. But remember that God does some of his best work on desert detours. So what happens on desert detours? I want to mention 4 things and then we're done. What happens in desert detours? Number one, we learn to patiently depend on God. Have you noticed that God never seems to be in a hurry? Isn't that one of his most irritating attributes? In the desert, we learn to depend upon a God who is not in a hurry. This is one of the lessons you only learn in the desert. And so every day, the people of the Exodus wake up and there's this cloud. And they've got to decide every day, will we follow the cloud today? And even worse, what if the cloud doesn't move? If the cloud sits here today, will we sit here waiting for it? When we think we know the way to the promised land, will we decide to follow day by day, one day at a time? God teaches this in the desert in other ways too. For the people of the Exodus, remember, God provides manna for them to eat, this bread-like substance that came every morning like dew on the ground, and they were to gather just enough for that day. But some of the people got impatient, and they tried to gather the manna. They tried to hoard it. And it says in Exodus 16 that when they try to keep the manna overnight, that the manna becomes filled with maggots and smells bad. Manna has a remarkably short shelf life, worse than bananas. You get just enough for this day, and by faith, you need to believe that God will provide for you again the next day. And the idea is after 100 days of receiving daily food, after 200 days, after 1,000 days, after 10,000 days, will I begin to believe that maybe God will provide for me tomorrow too? Will I learn to trust him each day? The desert is a place where you learn patience because you have to. So will you learn what it is to depend on him each day, one day at a time, and recognize that God is never in a hurry? Second thing that happens in the desert, we become strong. We become strong. Our text today says that God did not take him to the promised land the direct route. Why? It says because if they faced war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. Now, God is quite capable of defending them and defeating any army. That shouldn't be a problem. But God knows that the people don't believe this yet. And so God's going to take them on a desert detour where he will build their confidence. He will build their trust. He will make them strong. And those things cannot be taught on the short route. They're taught on the detours. God is not as concerned with where the people are going as who they will be when they get there. God's not as concerned about where they're going as who they will be when they get there. God's not as concerned about the kind of job that I have or the house that I have or the reputation that I have. God's concerned about who I am becoming. And most of the heroes of the Bible were familiar with the desert. Joseph is promised to be a great leader, but he doesn't go there immediately. The next day, he's sold into slavery by his brothers and will spend years in an Egyptian prison. He's on this massive detour. As a boy, David is anointed to be the king of Israel, but it wasn't a direct path to the throne. David will spend time in the desert running for his life from King Saul, who's trying to kill him. He's on this massive desert detour. And ask anybody that you respect spiritually. Find somebody that you believe to be strong in faith and wise in spirit, and I guarantee you that their journey includes a desert detour or two. That's where people are made strong. Number 3, in the desert, we come face to face with our temptation and our sin. The desert is a place of isolation and pain, and that's where I come face to face with the power of my own sin. This was true even for Jesus. Where did the tempter come to challenge Jesus? In the desert. In the desert. For the Israelites, they will face their ongoing temptation to return to Egypt. When the going gets tough, people want to go back to what they know, even if what they know is terrible. Right? You've known women who return repeatedly to abusive relationships, or who get out of a relationship and then only to get into another one with another abuser because it's all that they know. We see in the Exodus, you can take people out of slavery, but to get slavery out of the people is much more difficult. When faced with a choice between the known and the unknown, people often choose the known, even if the known isn't good. We cry, let's go back to Egypt. Life in Egypt was hard, but at least we knew what to expect. And in the face of the unknown, slavery in Egypt doesn't look so bad. And this happens in every sphere of life, even in churches. John Maxwell, when talking to church leaders, often says this. He says, every church has a back to Egypt committee. Let's go back to what we know. In the desert, the Israelites will face their temptation to run back to Egypt, their temptation to worship idols, their temptation to hoard provisions, their temptation to blame leaders for all of their problems, their temptation to complain and grumble, their temptation to identify themselves primarily as victims, their temptation to abandon God when God doesn't behave like they think God should. I've heard it said it took just one night to get Israel out of Egypt, but it took 40 years to get Egypt out of Israel. On the desert detours, you will come face to face with your temptations and sin. In the desert, you will see things about yourself that you previously could not see. And some of it's going to be ugly, and it's going to be painful things you're not proud of. But the God of forgiveness and of transformation and of power will meet you in the desert just like he did for the people of Israel. God will be with you in the desert. And lastly, in the desert, we learn to love God for God's sake and not for the sake of the milk and honey that he gives to us. I've been thinking about this one a lot. When I was in seminary, I worked in a mail room of a large company, and there were all these vending machines everywhere in the building. And one of the vending machines got broken for a while, broken in the fact that you didn't have to put money in. All these chips and candy bars and things, if you just punch the numbers, it would just required no money. How long do you think it took before employees reported this problem to management? I don't think they ever did. This became everyone's favorite machine. It's a miracle. It's the giver of all good things, and people visited this machine regularly. They went and paid homage to this giver of good gifts. And I remember the day that the vending repair company was out fixing it, and the guy was in there in the machine putting things back to their regular spot. As the repairman left, how many employees do you think thanked him for fixing the broken machine? Probably not a lot. In fact, this machine stopped being people's favorite. People stopped visiting this machine as regularly. This stopped being the machine in the building that they loved. Everything changed. The desert times are the times when no goodies come out of the machine. I don't get the promotion, the house, the success, the reputation, maybe even the healing or the health that I want. And I have to ask, do I really love God, or do I really love just the goodies that he brings to me? In the desert, this terrible and wonderful thing will happen. You will lose everything, and you will find God. Because God is in the desert, and God is all that you really need. He's a pillar of cloud by day, and he is a fire by darkest night. He is the God of the detour. Now, he's the God who goes to the throne by way of the cross, not the direct route. And for those of you that are on a desert detour right now, stay patient. The lessons we learn in the desert cannot be learned anywhere else. The day is coming, the Bible says, when every mountain will be laid low and every valley will be lifted up. There's a day coming when detours will be no more. But until that day comes, rejoice. Stand firm, for God is with you. Will you pray with me? God of the Exodus, deliver us from the things that hold us captive. Give us the strength and courage to follow you wherever you lead, to follow you even to the places that we do not want to go. Give us patience in the detours of life. Give us the ability to recognize you and to receive the lessons that you have for us. Meet us in the desert and shape us for the promised land. This we pray in the name of our deliverer, our Redeemer, Jesus Christ. And all God's people said.